So after about 15 years in storage, I decided to brush off my old NES toaster and give it a go. I was craving a little duck hunt. So after going through the ritual, you know, they blowing on the cartridge, kind of shoving it in, trying to get it to work. I fired it up and only to discover that my player 2 was not working. So I did, you know, the first thing you do is switch the controllers around and just to see if, you know, maybe the controller's dead or had a bad connection. That didn't solve the problem, so I had to dig a little deeper. So I'm going to run through that with you guys, how to troubleshoot and what I found when I did my repair. And yeah, hopefully that helps you if you have a similar problem with a dead controller on the old classic NES toaster. Okay, so first step is disassembly. Depending on your NES, you know, mine's just a Phillips or a star screwdriver. Some of them I believe use the security bits. So depending on your model, you may or may not need the security bits. If you do need them, you can get them on eBay or for pretty cheap. So flip it over. So we got the 6 screws out. Now the top comes off. And lift that up. So the next step is going to be to pull the motherboard off. So to pull the motherboard off, you got 4 screws. 1, 2, 3, 4. And note that this one in this corner is a bit longer than the rest. Now this is a bit longer one too. So the 2s in the end are the silver ones that are a touch longer than the rest. Sorry, we got to pull this screw as well. And there's one more in here. Alright, at that point we can lift the whole motherboard out. So you can see we got 3 connectors here. We got this guy and these 2. So now if I were just troubleshooting, so what I would do is start with, we'll get this out of the way. So we'll disconnect that controller, and then we got the 2 for the now that guy comes off. So now if I were just starting my troubleshooting, first thing I would do is I would take and I would swap these 2. So I would plug player 2 into, so normally it sits like this, so that's normally player 1, that's player 2. So I would take player 2, I would plug it into the player 1 slot, and take player 1, plug it into the player 2 slot, and now I would go you know, set it back in the case, put a game in just like you normally would, plug it in and fire it up and see if your problem is still there. So if it's the controller port, what would happen is that by swapping them, now if player 2 wasn't working before, player 2, which is now player 1, would stop working if it was, or would now be working, and player 1 wouldn't be if it's the port. If it's the motherboard, you'd swap it, player 1 would still work on the player 2 plug, if that makes sense. So in my case, when I went through that, I fired it up, with the plugs flipped, and what happened was player 1 still worked as the second player port, but player 1 was still dead. So that told me that the 2 ports are good and that the problem is with the motherboard. Now if you had the opposite, if you swapped them and now player 1 stopped working but player 2 worked as it was plugged into player 1 port, then that would tell you that your player 2 port is dead. Anyhow. So from here, next step is to inspect the motherboard and look for any damage. So to do that, we're pretty close. We just have 2 more screws here to pull this off, and then we can take a good look at the motherboard. Okay, so now you've done that, now this guy is clipped underneath, so it just kind of pulls forward, and then from there you can slide it kind of back and off. Or sorry, it just pulls forward and off. So I'll set that aside. So now we can get a good look at the motherboard. So what you're seeing here is some tape over the wire, the jumper wire I had to put in to repair this motherboard. So I'll kind of run through that process. So you can see, in my case, this was my repair. So I jumpered from this pin to this pin because there's I'll switch to a picture here so you can see better, but basically I had a little bit of corrosion on my motherboard that was that caused this connection to stop working. So just to kind of, in my case, the problem was with my player 2, which again, normally this thing sits in here like this. So that's player 1, that's player 2. So player 2 being these ones. So the way a player 2 works, is that these go through some capacitors and then come down to these two chips. And then from here it goes out to some of the other chips on the board. Player 1 kind of comes through here to these two and then out to other chips. So what I ended up doing is flip it over, and because I knew, I'd kind of spotted this area of corrosion, and so that's where I kind of focused my effort. Also knowing that these two are the chips. These two are these two chips, which I know are part of the player 2 kind of pins and power or path for the current. So seeing this corrosion spot and knowing that that's player 2, that's where I started to look. So here's a bit of a close-up on what I'm talking about. So in my case, I had a patch of corrosion here, which I'll show you on another photo. So I kind of focused myself here, and knowing that again these two chips are part of that player 2, which is kind of in that general vicinity. So what I did is I started kind of following the trace on each of these pins and just making sure I had continuity from each pin to kind of where the next solder point that it goes to. So anyway, set up the voltmeter and get your head in there and just kind of trace your pin. So in my case, the third pin down here should connect to here. When I first tested this board before the repair, it wasn't connecting, so I kind of knew that that's where my problem was. And now when I flipped it over to the back side, this pin and this pin are connected with the trace on the back. So I went to this pin instead just because it was a little bit easier than going to this one where all the corrosion was. Similarly, you could take test kind of each pin systematically. So that one, the trace goes down to sorry, it's kind of hard to see here, but yeah, so that pin goes down to this pin down here, and you can see I have 0 ohms, so that's a good connection. So anyway, systematically step through all the pins in any areas that look suspect. And like I said, in my case, I found a dead connection between this pin and this pin, which I have now repaired. And then from there, I got out my soldering iron and soldered in a small jumper wire between these two pins. And presto changeo, we put it all back together and fired it up, and yeah, we were in business. Got to play some good old duck hunt. So while we're here, I'm going to talk about a couple other things. So one other thing I would recommend is disabling the lockout security chip while you're here and you have the motherboard out. So Nintendo put a chip in here that corresponds to a chip on each game to verify that the game is an NES licensed game. Now that's what causes that blinking screen anytime you fire up your NES and the things aren't quite right. Well, that's because this lockout chip here thinks that you're trying to play a non-licensed game. So it's pretty easy to disable. So from the left here, you count to pin 4, and then get in there with, in my case I use a pair of side cutters, but get in there and cut that pin and just kind of bend it back to break that connection. So I recommend doing that while you're in here if you got your motherboard out anyways. And then the other thing I would suggest is cleaning your 32 pin connector. So there's lots of other YouTube videos on available for that, so I'm not going to go into the details, but definitely if you're already at this point, I would recommend cleaning that 32 pin connector while you're here. It'll just help give you make it a little easier to get games working in the future. So.